Hey listeners, just hopping on before this episode starts to just give you a little content warning that we do talk about kind of heavier topics in this episode today. We talk about workplace discrimination and sexual violence. While we don't get into too much of crazy details, I did want to just give a warning ahead of time that if that's something you're not in the mood to listen to right now, there are plenty of other episodes from this podcast that are a little bit lighter that you can definitely check out. But I was really excited to bring on a listener who's also a research fellow, and she specializes specifically in researching bisexuality and discrimination, and we had a really thoughtful conversation. And just something to keep in mind that, we are two cis white women, and I really recommend getting a fuller picture from different content creators and podcasters on what bisexual discrimination can look like when also combined with different intersectionalities. This is definitely a good starting point, but I really recommend just trying to find different content creators and read different things about discrimination and what that can look like. But yeah, back to the episode. Hello and welcome to Bisexual Behavior. I'm your host, Talia Cass, here with Liz, who is a listener, but also a researcher who has talked about many different topics with bisexuality, your biggest focus being bisexual discrimination right now. And I brought you on the show because I wanted to talk more in depth about discrimination, but also learn more about bisexual research and just the work that you do. And it's really important for me to talk to listeners and just different bisexual people to learn about their experiences. So Liz, I was so excited you reached out. Thank you so much for being on the show. How are you doing?
I am good, and I'm very excited to be on the show. Longtime fan, longtime listener. So
I love that people listen. It's crazy to hear that people listen to the show, but I appreciate it. I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. My name, again, is Talia. My pronouns are she, her. I am a bisexual cis white woman. What about you?
yeah, so Liz Quinn Jensen. I use she, her pronouns, and I am also a bisexual cisgender woman. White,
Excellent.
sorry.
So let's dive right into it. As you know, I have a famous warm-up question, and I am dying to know, what is your most bisexual behavior?
Yeah, so I love this question. So two things. First is my unfailing dedication to drinking iced coffee every day, regardless of the temperature outside. It could be -20, and I am rocking that iced coffee. And then my second is just talking about being bisexual. I will work it into every conversation, regardless of the topic. I have become an A+ player at navigating conversations and working in bisexuality as a topic. So.
It's quite a skill to be able to bring the conversation back to bisexuality, I will say. Very much a skill.
I don't know if I've mastered it, but segues, they're not happening. We're diving right into it. If the weather is raining, we're also talking about bisexuality. If we're watching cartoons, we're talking about bisexuality.
That's right. I love to point out characters that I like to think are bisexual, specifically in like cartoons and things. So I hear you on that. Actually, I annoy all my friends because whenever we're talking about like celebrity gossip or just like music we like, I'm like, oh, did you know they're actually bisexual? And everyone's like, yeah, Talia, shut up. Like, we don't care that much. But everyone needs to know, damn it. That's my way of life. So
Yeah, we gotta make sure that we're combating bisexual invisibility, right? If that means talking about it nonstop, that's what we're gonna do.
that's right. And something that we talked about briefly before we had to restart recording was that like there's these different stereotypes that don't always make sense and they're kind of silly, but bisexual people just like cling on to them. And what were some of the ones that you mentioned? I already forgot.
Yeah, aside from the iced coffee one, I love the stereotype that bisexual people can't sit properly in a chair. Hashtag that is me 100%. And then I also love the cuff jeans and the tucking of the shirt stereotype. Also rock those looks and have solidly for a good 10 years now. So those are some of my kind of weird but funny stereotypes that I like.
I'm here with you with the like sitting weird in a chair. I want to get the ones that you see on Amazon that like are meant for people who like want to stretch out their legs or they want to like sit cross-legged or have like one leg out. That's like totally me. I need to invest in those. So, and I don't know about it. It's true. Every bisexual person I know just like can't sit normal. It's strange. I also see these different stereotypes or just like bisexual culture things on Reddit where they say that all bisexual people like frogs and lemon bars. And I'm like, I don't know where that came from. Um, but I find it kind of hilarious because it's like such a random thing. But Liz, I'd love to hear more about your research and kind of how you got into doing research to begin with and what drew you to talking more about bisexuality.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think it's a really interesting question. And so a lot of it stemmed from some of my own personal experiences as a bisexual woman. In particular, I remember when I was just leaving undergrad, considering grad school, I was going to apply for the Pride Foundation scholarship, which is a scholarship for LGBTQ plus people. And I remember telling some people that I was interested in applying for it. And the response I got was, well, like, are you, have you don't really, you haven't experienced discrimination enough as a bisexual person, have you, to really qualify for this? Or do you really experience enough prejudice? And of course, that sent me spiraling of like, oh my God, have I? Like, do bisexual people not experience discrimination? And so that really stemmed and kind of pushed me into a lot of the research I've been doing in grad school. This idea of like, do people think that bisexual people don't experience discrimination? And so I actually did kind of a review of the literature on this. And I was like, well, what do we know about this? Well, we know that bisexual people are sexual minorities, right? So they do experience some level of prejudice and discrimination, but they're also believed to hold bisexual privilege or heterosexual privilege, right? Especially when they're in these hetero passing relationships. And so they are believed to have some privilege. And there's no doubt that to some degree, right, if you are a bisexual person in a hetero passing relationship, like you're not going to walk down the street and have slurs yelled at you or necessarily be attacked based on your sexual orientation if you're not in some other way indicating it, right? But we also know from the literature that bisexual people do experience a lot of prejudice and discrimination, and in particular, the prejudice that they experience is very unique from other sexual minorities. And you've had guests on the show already talk about that a lot of times, right? Like having your sexuality invalidated. A lot of people think that bisexuality isn't real. They tend to think bisexual women are actually straight and bisexual men are actually gay. And what's unique is they experience prejudice from both heterosexual or straight people, as well as some prejudice still from the LGBTQ community. So I was like, well, this is a really interesting question. And so I found this law review by a professor named Ann Tweedy, and she had looked at workplace discrimination lawsuits brought by out bisexual people. And she actually found that there were only 12 cases in the law literature, and only one was successful. And so there's probably a whole lot of reasons why bisexual people don't bring lawsuits, right? Probably because they're afraid that people won't take their cases seriously. But I was really interested in this fact that like only one of those cases was successful, because it's a very low number and kind of horrifying. And so it got me thinking, well, maybe there is some truth to this fact that people really do that think that bisexual people just aren't as likely to be discriminated against, or that their discrimination isn't as likely to be taken seriously. And so that's kind of what pushed me into the research paper that I recently had published.
Wow. So you make a lot of good points here about, of course, things that I've talked about before with other guests, where, of course, women who are bisexual are seen as straight and men are seen as gay. I also am curious about how, like, this privilege that you mentioned, like the straight passing privilege, can have negative effects outside of just somebody maybe feeling like alone in their identity. Is that something that you've explored in your research or you have gathered thoughts on?
Yeah, it's not something I've explored too much in my research aside from the study where we did find that, this idea of bisexual privilege or the perception of having this, heterosexual privilege, it does seem to be a factor that influences whether at least bisexual women are seen as victims of discrimination compared to like lesbian women. Um,
Mhm.
Interestingly, we don't see that in the case for bisexual men. They're not seen as having this privilege that bisexual women are seen as having, which is a whole nother interesting topic that I'm happy to talk about as well. But I do think there are a lot of implications for this, right? Like if you're in a hetero passing relationship and you're believed to have this privilege, it can feel very isolating in terms of you don't feel like you're part of the LGBT broader community, right? You don't feel necessarily
Mhm.
welcomed in LGBTQ spaces. And that's something I've struggled with. I've been in a long term partnership with a cisgender man. We're married now, but for a long time, I didn't feel like I had like enough credibility to be in these LGBTQ spaces, because I didn't feel like for a long time I was like, I didn't feel welcome, but I also felt internally like I'm taking up space there that necessarily isn't for me or could be more advantageous to other people. And I really had to fight to kind of get out of that mindset. And I think a lot of bisexual people, particularly because they're believed to have this privilege, have to get out of this mindset and really struggle with this mindset of like, I don't belong in the community because I have potentially this privilege, especially when in hetero passing relationships.
So, Liz, you mentioned privilege specifically for bisexual people, and that if somebody's in a hetero relationship or a straight passing relationship, where they like to say that there's privilege that goes along with it. So, I'd like to learn a little bit about what you've learned with the word privilege and how that really affects a bisexual person from your research. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of my research, we did find that at least bisexual women, right, because of this alleged privilege, are seen as less likely to be victims of discrimination compared to lesbian women. Interestingly, this was not the case for bisexual men. So I think an argument could be made that maybe bisexual men, because maybe they're perceived as gay, are less likely to be perceived as having this privilege. But I think in terms of just isolation and what I've learned in terms of general bisexuality and this idea of heterosexual privileges, I think it can make the experience of being bisexual very isolating, in particular when it comes to feeling like you're part of the broader LGBTQ plus community, right? If you're in this hetero or straight passing relationship, I think oftentimes it feels like you don't belong in those spaces, or you're fearful that you'll be perceived as not belonging in those spaces. And I've been in a partnership with a cisgender man for 13 years as of 2 days ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of times I avoided LGBTQ plus spaces because I feared that I would be perceived as having this privilege and then therefore less likely to be perceived as a member of that community. So I think it has these broad reaching implications just beyond, how likely is someone's to be seen as a victim of discrimination, but also like how included and inclusive these spaces feel that you are a part of. And I think for a lot of bisexual people, it's a lot of mental gymnastics to get over that, especially if you are in these hetero passing relationships.
Yeah, and so we're talking a lot about the word discrimination, and I think that that can be a very broad word. From your research, have you found that there are certain types of discrimination that are more common among bisexual people? And yeah, and how does that line up with, your own experience?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've really only studied discrimination in terms of being in the workplace, and there is a lot of data showing that bisexual people do experience discrimination in the workplace. And some of that discrimination is types of prejudice that other sexual minorities experience, like not being promoted for jobs based on their sexual identity, or not being hired or being fired unfairly. There's also these really unique types of bisexual discrimination that occurs. So bisexual employees are more likely to be sexually harassed. And that's not just in the workplace, that's like a broader phenomenon that unfortunately happens in the US. And that's because of these stereotypes, right? That bisexual people are promiscuous, they're hypersexual. And so that feeds into this ability of people thinking that bisexual people are sexually available and they want to be flirted with, they want to have sexual contact, when that's not true. A lot of times we don't want to be touched without consent, right? I think that's a general human phenomenon. But that is something that is very prominent for bisexual people in the workplace. But I know from the literature, right, that this isn't something that just happens in predominantly heterosexual spaces, right? Bisexual people do still experience discrimination in spaces that are supposed to be safe for, bisexual and other sexual minority groups. And so that's also kind of a bummer. I do think there's some data showing that's changing, right? That we are being more included in these LGBTQ plus spaces. But it's also interesting that there's a lot of research showing that gay and lesbian and heterosexual people are less likely to date bisexual people. So that's you often don't think about that as a form of discrimination or prejudice, but it is, right? Like we are ousted as potential partners because of these stereotypes as well, that we're unfaithful, we're promiscuous, we don't want to be monogamous. And every relationship's different. You can be monogamous in your relationships, you can have non-monogamous relationships, but to kind of have this blanket stereotype that all bisexual people can't be monogamous is, I think, makes it very hurtful in terms of people not wanting to date bisexual people. So
Yeah, that's something I definitely saw when I first came out and I was starting to date and was on the dating apps. And as scary as that can be, I felt like I was having a harder time finding women with being openly bisexual. Like I put it on my profile because I wanted to weed out people who are biphobic. And I found that men weirdly cared less about it. But as I thought about it, that's because bisexual women are fetishized, whereas lesbian women or lesbian pan queer women might see bisexual people as a threat. They're slutty, they're also dating men. So I think it's really interesting that you brought that up, and I'm curious, so how did you conduct this research? You mentioned that you mainly did research in the workplace. Like, what was that process like?
yeah, so we didn't actually, so our data isn't from actual workplaces. We essentially asked, and we just conducted this research study with straight people at this point,
Hmm.
because in the workplace, straight people still have the most influence and power to kind of make these discriminatory decisions.
Sure.
But we essentially asked heterosexual people to read this story about a bisexual person who um, they worked at a law firm. They are a very good employee. They seem to care about their job, and they apply for this law school funding opportunity that the law firm awards people every year. And then we made people think about, like, make these mental comparisons between bisexual and gay and lesbian people, or bisexual and heterosexual people. And when you really make people make these kind of comparisons, so that a bisexual person's privilege is very salient, right? They're less likely to say that a bisexual person was that this not getting the funding was discrimination, right? When you make them kind of make these comparisons with gay and lesbian people versus heterosexual people. And this was particularly true for bisexual women, not
Mhm.
bisexual men.
Interesting.
And so it wasn't that it was actually in the workplace, it was that we had people kind of read this story and then offer their opinions about what they thought happened there.
Oh, that's an interesting way to do it. I find that there's really not a lot of research on bisexuality in general. And I wonder if it's because it's hard to quantify, because there are a lot of people who are bisexual who aren't openly bisexual, for example, or there are people who are in same-sex relationships that could present as gay or lesbian. So I think that could be kind of one of the things that makes bisexuality even more hidden. Yeah, I'm curious about, there's also a lot of intersectionalities when you think about discrimination and different levels of how that can affect a bisexual person who may be of a different race, or they're biracial, and all of those factors can influence that. Is that something that you found in your research as well, or that you've noticed as you were looking into discrimination as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's both of those points are really interesting. I want to address kind of the first point you made about
Sure.
not a lot of research on bisexuality, because that is true. And I'm actually doing a content analysis right now with some of my undergraduate students where we're looking at studies in social psychology journals that have included bisexual participants, how they go about defining what bisexuality is, like how are they measuring that.
Mhm.
And it is really interesting because some people will let participants opt into self-identifying. Some of it is based on behavior, which I always think is kind of in my opinion, a problematic way of interpreting whether someone is bisexual, right?
Right,
Um,
yeah.
and we do find that, like, bisexual studies and studies on bisexual people are vastly understudied in the literature. And part of the problem, which is interesting, is that it's not seen as a broad problem, right? The thing is, bisexual people are such a small population in the US population. So, like, this, we're not testing some broader phenomenon, but really bisexual people are the largest portion of the
Mhm.
LGBTQ plus community. So, like, we are a large population, and that number is growing, right? Statistics show that more people every year are identifying as bi, pan, fluid, queer, right?
Mhm.
And so that is really interesting that there is this really this effect of understudying bisexuality in the social psychology literature. And to your second point on intersectionality, I think it's something as well that I personally really care about, and I think we're starting to care about more as researchers. Like, we can't look
Mhm.
at social identities in isolation. And we do see that in my research, in that when you're taking into account both bisexuality, like sexual orientation, and gender, right? That we don't see this effect with bisexual men, perhaps because people view them similarly to gay men, right? And
Mhm.
so if we just looked at bisexual women, we would have made these blanket statements that, like, oh, this privilege only and how it affects whether someone is seen as a victim of discrimination really only applies to all bisexual people. But when you look at gender too, we find that's not the case. And I think you would find some interesting effects too if you also look at race, right? Like we know that racial minorities, right, experience more discrimination too. And so if you're looking at a bisexual Black woman, maybe people would be more likely to think that they're going to be a target of discrimination, because they probably are, more than a bisexual white woman, right? And so I do think it is important in this future research to incorporate intersectionality and different types of social identities, because we can't apply blanket statements to just one group of people, right? Because we all have so many different social identities.
Yeah, I think it also what you're saying about how how there's a lack of research in bisexuality because how do you quantify it? I think that also plays into just the fact that our society is so focused on single attraction, or you're either gay or you're straight. There's no in betweens, and I think that it's really hard for just people to study that and quantify what that actually looks like, because it's like not the actual norm. And that what you mentioned also about bisexual men, I also wonder if a lot of that discrimination isn't as open in the workplace as it is in relationships. And I know that there's research or studies that show that bisexual women have higher rates of sexual violence, and I'm sure the case is probably very similar for bisexual men, maybe not as high. But from the bisexual men that I spoke to who have written books about it, it sounds like a lot of that discrimination is like in relationships more specifically, or when they're talking to straight women. A lot of women see bisexual men as they're just gay because they don't fit into a masculine persona. So I think that there's so many layers to it that makes it so hard to just research. And I'm curious, like, how do you see the future of research?
Yeah, he brought up some really interesting points. I think talking about sort of, first of all, addressing your first point about like, intimate partner relationship violence, there is a lot of research showing, and I do some advocacy work on campus with this as well, showing that bisexual people and bisexual women in particular are more likely to experience this discrimination and violence within relationships. Part of that is also right due to these bisexual stereotypes. A lot of, especially if you're in a relationship with a man, if you're a bisexual woman, right, straight men sometimes want to prove that you're not really bisexual, right?
Right.
Which is like absurd. But also it is harder when you're a bisexual man, and particularly if you're in a relationship with someone who identifies as a man as well, because you may be less inclined to want to report it, right? Because you're like, it defies our stereotypes of what intimate partner violence looks like, right? Our stereotype is it's a man who's inflicting violence on a woman. And so when we don't fit that stereotype, I think a lot of times we're worried that we're not going to be taken seriously. And I think there's a lot of thinking among bisexual men of like, okay, well, I could just fight back, right? Like it's an equal fight. And it's essentially a horrible and crude way of thinking about that. But unfortunately, that's a way a lot of times that these people who are hearing these cases are taking this and then dismissing it. And so it's really unfortunate in that sense. But in terms of like where we're going research wise, there has been a lot of talk lately about we need to really be more mindful and really think through how we are quantifying and like talking about what is bisexuality. Like, is it something that like when we're measuring bisexuality, we ask someone, are you bisexual? Like, should we just ask them to self-identify? And in some ways, that's a really good way of doing it, right? In other ways, though, maybe someone's not sure if they're bisexual, right? There's so many labels, and I think we're moving towards this idea of like, we don't have to label everything, right?
Yeah.
I like talking about and using the bisexual label because I feel like it increases visibility for people who aren't hetero or identify as gay or lesbian, right? Who more encompass this fluid sexual identity. And so I do think the label is helpful in that sense, but I think hopefully we're moving towards this thing where we don't have to have labels, right? You just love, you want to have a sexual relationships or loving romantic relationships, whoever you want to. And so really we're trying to figure out in the research right now, how do we quantify this? How do we measure it? What's the best way to capture what bisexuality really is? Because it's so unique to the individual. Like how you describe your bisexuality is probably very different from how I describe my bisexuality, and so on and so forth. And so there was a lot of talk about what's a unifying way to best capture what bisexuality is. And it's really, really hard. And I understand that. And I try to be sympathetic to that because it really is hard because it's so unique. but
And
also
like
just
the trends are changing too with sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like with
oh
the
no,
types of
go.
labels people use too, because there's more use of the term pansexuality or people who just identify as queer. And that must make it also even harder to research because then there's all these different categories that how do you quantify the difference? Because even queer people still question what the difference is between bisexuality and pansexuality, which there is a difference, but it's almost different to every single person. So I'm sure that's something that affects it as well.
It is very hard, yeah, and especially when you're recruiting quote, bisexual participants, you'll often get people who use more than one label as well. And so when you're trying to think like, is this phenomenon specific to people who think about bisexuality in one way? It's hard then to quantify that to all people who might fall under the umbrella of bisexuality or fluid sexual identity. And so it is really hard. And we are, I think, moving away from the bisexual label. I think a lot of us still use it. At least I still use it because I feel like people understand it to some degree. Because as you said, right, when we use queer, and I have used queer before, a lot of people don't know what that means. Like they're like, cool, what is that? Like, are
Yeah.
you a lesbian? Are you bi? Like, what does queer mean?
And it can
And you're
mean
right,
gender
it's so deep.
queer.
It can, yeah.
Hmm.
It's so broad of a category. So
It
yeah,
also
it
like
is
can trigger people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a personal experience that I had that was like I want to say it was workplace discrimination because I also think discrimination sometimes can be hard to identify because it's so subtle. And like, I guess that can be the same thing with like microaggressions, right? Like, that's something that maybe only like a person who's experienced that can really identify what it means. I was at a workplace and it was actually like a sexual violence advocacy center. So they supported victims and, helped with housing. There was all these different programs. It was basically against domestic violence, which sounds like it's a great place to work. Weirdly, though, their violence was more against their employees. But I remember I was assigned to do a like workplace training. I think I was probably the only openly like queer person in the office, and I was invited to do like a training for the staff to talk about I'm trying to remember what the training was called. It was like this like certified thing where you just like go over a PowerPoint and talk about like all the different identities, what they mean, like the nuances of it, and all of that. And it was like a 2 hour long presentation. And then the executive director stopped me and she was just like, queer is actually a derogatory term. And I was like, well, it used to be, it's a term that's reclaimed. And that's something that, like, it's really important to hear the language that that person is using because you don't want to say someone's queer if that's something that could trigger them. So it's, even though it's being reclaimed, it can be kind of touchy with people, that kind of thing. And then since then, that same executive director would like insult me for like talking about pride related things and would like say like I'm super straight but I could celebrate pride better than you because I had to like write a social media post and not like talking about pride, and they're like this isn't emotional enough. I'm like super straight but I could be more emotional than this. So like I wasn't sure if that's like an insult on my work or just picking at me specifically because I'm queer and open about it and it makes them uncomfortable. So it's like, I feel like discrimination can be so ominous because it's like, is this like really directed at my sexuality or not? Even though it like, you can look back and think like, yes. But I'm sharing that because like when you talk about workplace discrimination, I think that sometimes that can be hard for people to quantify as well, in addition to when you're doing research and you're trying to quantify how do you understand if someone's bisexual. So I know I just rambled a little bit, but I guess yeah, so that just leaves me to wonder like what other types of like avenues do you want to do when it comes to research? Are you interested in learning more about discrimination, or are you kind of like looking into doing more just queer studies in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot about my future because I'm very close to going on the job market to try and get a faculty position. Like, what's the researcher I want to be?
Mhm.
But I do want to say in regards to your comment about workplace discrimination being really ambiguous, you're right. Anytime we experience discrimination, right? I think we have to go through these mental gymnastics of, okay, is this actual discrimination? Am I reading too much into this? And
Mhm.
especially as women, right? I think a lot of
Right,
times too, we also are more tend to be like, well, maybe it's just I'm reading into it more than it is, right?
right.
And we also did have a lot of participants who were like, well, you didn't give me enough information to know if this was discrimination in our study, because we always have a comment box at the end, which is both a terrifying and but informative practice of having participants be able to leave comments about what they thought of the study. And yeah, a lot of them were like, you didn't give me enough information to know if this is discrimination. That being said, when we're deciding whether or not something is discrimination, we often do decide based on a limited amount of information. And so, yeah, you're 100% right. It is hard. And in your situation, right, to me, it sounds like discrimination, right? Maybe that's
Right.
because I'm also bisexual or queer, but I could see you having that conundrum of like, all right, am I being too sensitive? Like, am I being targeted? Is this a microaggression? And not being really sure because it is so ambiguous and sort of subtle, right?
Right.
Discrimination today isn't what it used to be, right? It's not like the mass amounts of discrimination that bisexual people face as you're walking down the street and somebody screams a slur at you. Now, does that happen? Of course it does.
Right.
But that is not modern day discrimination, right? Modern day discrimination is this very subtle discrimination that is very hard to discern. And so it does make it very tricky, especially when conducting these studies.
Yeah, and I know I was very vague on like how I described what happened to me, but it was a very much a situation where it started after I had like I talked about my girlfriend at the time. And then I was asked to do this presentation where I was openly talking about it. And then it became since then I started to get bullied and then was pushed out of my job. So it's like those types of things that trickle and there's no way I could have fought back on it. I couldn't have been like, this is discrimination because I'm openly bisexual, right? So I think that also with bisexuality, it makes it really hard to be able to fight back, makes it hard to like I think you mentioned in your research paper that I was reading that like there's less of a record of lawsuits related to bisexual discrimination because like there's that, you know, idea that you have too much privilege because you're bisexual, so you're not really queer enough for this to be discrimination.
Yeah, so if I can turn on my researcher hat for a little bit, I know that I'm supposed to be here, the interviewee, but this is really interesting to me. So when you were, first of all, I want to apologize for the fact that that happened to you.
Oh, it's okay. I have a much better job now. It's fine.
Well, that's good. You
Yeah.
still shouldn't have had to
Yeah.
experience that way. I'm sorry. But when you were thinking about, I'm sure you had this moment after you're fired where like, should I pursue some avenue of like a lawsuit or some kind of something, right?
Mhm.
Did you go through that mindset of, well, no one's going to really take me seriously because I'm bisexual, right? Did you go
Yeah.
through that mindset? Did you feel that way? What was like
Yes.
the deciding factor?
So, I wanted to actually complain to the board about the whole situation, but I felt like honestly, it was the person had manipulated me so much at that point that I just didn't have the confidence. I didn't know how I could relay to a board of directors that like this was related to discrimination, and I knew that that woman knew exactly how to turn my words. Anytime I fought back on anything, she's like, "Well, I wrote this list," or something like that, you know. So I think I was in the type of situation where there was like really nothing I could do that would have convinced it. And also that board of directors, they're all straight white people. Like I don't know what they would have been able to take away from that or even understand the complexities of it. They would have just supported their executive director, which kind of, you know, there's a lot of issues in workplaces in the corporate world and, you know, in private sector, but nonprofit, I think people don't realize that there's a lot of weird shit going on in nonprofit worlds, especially because if you're not choosing good board members that represent like who you're serving, then like it's just a bunch of rich people who are retired, honestly.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Again, I apologize that that happened to you. That's so unfair and unjust, and that makes me so angry on your behalf. And
I
that's
think
one
that people
reason.
have gone through worse. That's why I wanted to share it. I really think that like my story is just a small piece of like what a lot of queer people experience, whether you're bisexual or you're lesbian or you're, you know, whatever. So,
Yeah, it is. So in terms of you were asking where I want to go with this, we really focused on this paper that I've kind of been talking about on why people's discrimination lawsuits, why bisexual people specifically, why their lawsuits might not be like taken seriously. But I think the second half of that, which you brought up, the lawsuit of like not even filing a lawsuit in the first place.
right.
I mean, the fact that there were only 13 in the span of this multi-decade law review is very interesting to me because that was not the case for gay and lesbian people, right? They filed a multitude of lawsuits. And so I would
Interesting.
really love to try and better understand, like, is the reason that bisexual people aren't filing this lawsuits is A, they're less likely to interpret the things that happen to them as discrimination, or they think they're not going to be believed, which my data shows that that's a possibility, right? But I think if we can understand that, then we can maybe encourage bisexual people to come forward when these things happen instead of just letting it go. And I think it's easy to say, and I'm not trying to call you out, but you made this comment yourself of like, worse people have experienced worse, right? And so I
Yeah.
think when you're bisexual and these happen to you, you're so likely like, people have it worse than me, right? Like, but this thing that happened to you is still something that shouldn't be happening. And so really kind of understanding what's going on, what are we telling ourselves when we experience this discrimination that is prohibiting us from moving forward with this, and then understanding that better will help us so that maybe we can make people not as hesitant to file these lawsuits or to write off discrimination.
Yeah, because I mean,
And again,
bisexual
I
people.
didn't mean to call you out, but I
Oh,
hear those excuses all the time, and I'm like, no, this matters too.
and it's what I need to hear, honestly. Like, that's why I'm glad that I brought it up with you because I feel like sometimes it's like hearing somebody from another perspective be like, no, that's like the actual discrimination. But yeah, I wonder, like, do you know what like resources there are for people who have, experienced discrimination? Like, are there certain nonprofit groups or like lawyers out there that work particularly with bisexual people? And if you don't know, that's okay.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend. I don't know a lot of them. I know definitely reaching out to the American Civil Liberties Union. They do a lot of work in the space of both like racial and sexual orientation discrimination, as well as like trans discrimination. I think they're a great resource for people who are like questioning whether they are experiencing discrimination and then they're trying to move forward with that. But there are also a multitude of websites, I can't remember them, where you can go for people who will advocate for you if you feel like you have been targeted based on your sexual identity or sexual orientation. But I think the first step is convincing people that that happens so that they seek out those resources, right? And sometimes that maybe is just talking to one of those people like myself being like, yeah, girl, this happened and this was
Yeah.
real. Like you should do something about this so it doesn't continue to happen. But yeah, I can definitely try and find more resources. I'm happy to send you links to places that I
Yeah.
would recommend people seek out if they have any questions about it, even if they're just not sure, if they have any questions that they could go to.
Yeah, I think like having an advocate too is really helpful. I mean, from when I worked at that domestic violence shelter, a lot of the times the victims of sexual assault, like they need someone to speak for them because it's so traumatic. There's like a lot of emotional layers that come with experiencing some kind of discrimination, some kind of violence. So I think that like that's such a great resource. And one thing I did want to mention, it's like, why is this important that we're talking about it? Because bisexual people have like the highest rates of mental health disparities, of substance abuse, of sexual violence, like all of those things across the board. And then you see people like who see that and they're like, why is that? Like that's they could just be straight, So it's just interesting that there's, not enough people talking about it and they're afraid to talk about it, but it's important because a lot of people feel
Yeah.
alone.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like you know your stats well. Like bisexual people are much more likely to, report experiencing depression, anxiety, substance abuse, intimate partner violence, sexual harassment than other groups, heterosexual and LGBTQ members.
Mhm.
And a lot of that is because of the very unique what it's referred to in the literature, and I kind of love this term as the bisexual burden.
Mhm.
Which I think is really interesting because bisexual people do experience a very specific type of prejudice that, in some ways, in some aspects, is very similar to gay and lesbian people and other sexual minorities, right? But in a lot of ways, there's discrimination and prejudice we face that is very unique to our sexual identity. And that's really hard. Like, imagine being told that you're not real. Like, that is just such an, I don't think we fathom the impact of that, right? Like, if somebody told you, no, you're not a real girl, like because you
Mhm.
identify as a cisgender woman, like imagine the impact of that. You're like, no, wait, I am, right? But like
Right.
hearing that message constantly, and not just from media or people you care about, you see it on TV, right? And I think we're
Mhm.
getting better at that, but you also see this on TV, and it's really hard, and it does take an emotional toll. And I think it is hard, yeah. And I do think we need to bring attention to it because these are very real issues. The consequences of this are very real and very damaging, and it is something that should be taken very seriously.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about it and talk about your research. Is there anything else that you want our listeners to know about your research or just, in general about just you?
Yeah. I think one of the things we didn't look at in this research, this particular study, and I'm also happy to send you the link to the paper if
Hmm.
any of your listeners want to read it,
For sure.
is that we didn't look at the effect of partner gender. So we just had them like hear about a bisexual person, but we didn't specify partner gender. And I do think, in terms of next steps, I think that's really important.
Hmm.
I think a lot of times, especially for bisexual people, partner gender is used as this proxy for your sexual orientation, right?
Right.
And so I do think, and this is something that in those lawsuits that Professor Ann Tweedy found was in some of those court cases, they did bring up partner gender. Like one guy's case was not taken seriously because he was once married to a woman. And so I do think it's important to think about how who we're dating or who we're married to or who we're sexually like more who we're having sexual relationships with can in fact impact these perceptions of the validity of our sexual orientation, but also the validity of whether we've been victims of discrimination. So, if I tell you, oh, I'm married to a cisgender man and somebody in the workplace discriminated against me because I'm bisexual, you're probably less likely, or at least most people who aren't bisexual are less likely to think that I really was a victim of discrimination, because they're like, what are they discriminating against you? You're married to a man, a cisgender man, right? Which is probably less likely the case if you were in a relationship with someone who identifies as the same gender, or you're in a non-hetero passing relationship. And so I just always feel like that's important to say, because I do think it makes an impact. Yeah.
Yeah, again, there's so many layers to it, and I'm sure that like gender plays a role too. So say if you're somebody who's non-binary or genderqueer, like how does that also impact your bisexuality? And that kind of goes in with discrimination. So there's got to be a lot to research, and I'm sure it can be very overwhelming to look into. So kudos to you for putting in the work and helping bisexuals feel more seen. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about, and something that I'm really excited to keep doing, and hopefully bring more awareness to the issue. So
yeah, so I would love to share your research with listeners. If there's a link or anything like that, I can put it in the show notes. But is there anything you'd like to plug before we wrap up?
oh gosh, plug this podcast. People are listening. They're probably already but no, I would just say we talked about a lot of broad themes and not the minute details of the study, which is perfectly fine, because I'm sure your listeners don't want to be like, how did you measure this since this and this and this? But I would say, like, I encourage people to go read the paper. I can also send you a link to a blog post I wrote about that's a little bit more digestible. To be fair to my fellow academics and myself, we often write for other scientists when we publish these papers, so they can be a lot. They can be a lot to read. So I think the blog post does a really good job of kind of breaking it down in a more digestible format for people who are interested in the topic. So.
And I think just even talking about it broadly makes it more accessible for people, because it's probably a really scary topic. So it's nice to hear you kind of put it into digestible terms, if you will.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for being on the show. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. And I look forward to talking to you again.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for all you're doing to increase bisexual visibility. I really appreciate it.
I love doing it. So thank you for supporting.